Welcome to the 20th episode of the second season of The Pulpiteer. I'm your host, Eric Hepburn, and I'm glad to have you join us for today's episode. Today's episode is called The Path to Wise Elderhood. It's about cultivating our capacity to bear faithful witness and to practice both praise and grief. We'll wrestle with the question, what is it that the 7 generations need for us to become? Okay, this week we begin with our Great World House segment and then move on to our Word of Wisdom delivered by Amy Cooper. We are, unfortunately, continuing to have some live recording technical issues, so there's some distortion and some background hum, for which I beg your indulgence, and I promise we're working diligently to return the podcast to its previous or even a better quality level. Thank you for your forbearance. On with the show. We pause now to honor the great world house of which we are a part, lifting up the hopes, the needs, and the voices beyond these doors. This week, Narges Mohammadi, the 2023 Nobel Prize laureate and a longtime advocate for women's rights in Iran, has been rearrested after speaking out publicly about injustice and loss. Her courage did not protect her from consequence. It never does. And yet, she continues to bear witness, not with weapons or slogans, but with her own body and voice and willingness to tell the truth. That is what elder courage looks like in a world that punishes it. Not domination, not certainty, not victory, but fidelity. Today, we hold her and so many like her in our hearts, and we ask what it means to become the kind of people, the kind of culture that does not require such courage to stand alone. Amen.
Let us enter a still space within, opening our hearts and minds to receive this voice of wisdom. After the words are spoken, we will breathe together in silence, preparing ourselves for the word unfolding among us. We welcome a voice of wisdom carried through mimus. Elderhood is not the harvest of years, but the flowering of a life that has learned to kneel before the real. It is born when sorrow becomes a teacher, when limits become companions, and when the heart grows spacious enough to welcome the world as it is. Wise elders are those whose presence steadies us, not because they have answers, but because their seeing is clear, their listening deep, and their lives shine with the same light that lives at the heart of all things. Cultures rise when such people walk among them, reminding us that wisdom is not an accomplishment, but a form of generosity. And in this fragile, beautiful moment of history, the world waits, not for heroes, but for elders willing to become the quiet, luminous ground which a more compassionate future can take root.
And in this fragile, beautiful moment of history, the world waits. Not for heroes, but for elders willing to become the quiet, luminous ground in which a more compassionate future can take root. I wanted to share with you all this morning some of the work that I've been doing in my Doctor of Ministry pursuit. It started here for me. I was struggling after the death of my sister from a fentanyl overdose with some grief that had come at me sideways, overwhelmed me. I wish I could say it was unexpected, but my sister ran away from home the first time when she was 14 years old. She was gone for 2 years without a word. She made it to 40, but somewhere along the line, I think she was about 36, she came to visit me, and I told her that I'd been waiting for the call since she was 14, the call that her luck had run out. So a good friend of mine who's a death doula said, "I've got the book for you." And it was a book called Die Wise by a man named Stephen Jenkinson. And he's become a powerful teacher for me, and I mention him from this pulpit somewhat often. But he said something that became the kernel of this Elderhood wisdom project that I'm working on. And he said, "It seems to me today that we have more old people than ever and somehow fewer wise elders." And as I am, I think he was aware that this might feel like some kind of individual indictment, but it isn't. It's really a cultural indictment. It's asking if we have the right systems, rituals, and culture in place to cultivate the leaders we need. And it doesn't take a lot to look out in the world today and recognize that the leaders we have are somehow morally deficient in ways that are both obvious and egregious. That's not a big stretch, is it? And it's not a big stretch, but what I want to say about it is that it is a thing worth grieving. But because we live in a grief-illiterate culture, we usually metastasize that heartbroken sadness straight into anger and outrage. I'm going to propose to you this morning that anger and outrage is a less good teacher than grief. Let's see if I can't make the case, if I can't make a case that both grief and praise are the habits of an elderhood wanting to be born among us. Some of you have heard this story before. I was at the men's breakfast a few weeks back and shared some of my family history. I am a child of unprepared teen parents. I read stories and hear testimony from people who had amazing positive role model families. That wasn't my experience. I've had to learn how I wanted to be by being given copious examples of how not to do it. That makes me lean a certain way when I do this work. But we honor the contributions of those who came before us by learning the lessons they teach. Whether they were positive role models or negative role models, whether their behavior is showing us the way we want to be in the world or giving us a warning sign of how not to be. We honor them as the beautiful soul that they are by learning the lesson that their presence teaches, positive or negative. I want to share with you something that I frequently use when I do memorial service work. In Japanese culture, there's an art form called kintsugi, where broken pottery is repaired with gold lacquer. Both the breakage and the repair become part of the history of the object. Not something to be disguised, discarded, or ignored, but something to be integrated into a deeper, more complex beauty. Rumi says this. He says, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." The wound is the place where the light enters you. Some people who I've read who love Rumi also say that it's the place where the light gets back out to share with one another as well. Grieving is a process of metabolizing our losses, digesting them. It is the gentle act of applying layers of gold lacquer, mindfully, sorrowfully, prayerfully, intentionally, to the cracks left in ourselves by the losses of that which we have loved. It is about accepting each other's love and support to hold the pieces together while we paint. An elder is like that, like a vase chased with gold lines. Kintsugi, like the spiritual arts of grief and praise, turns a broken thing into a thing of even deeper beauty. Have you seen what usually happens when we try to do that with super glue? I like to call it superficial glue. Have you noticed how we have to pretend that the cracks aren't there? That's what counterfeit-wise elderhood is like. I call it old adolescence. That is what it's like to age without maturing. We see prime examples on TV every day, and it's the same. What is the super glue? It's pretending everything's fine when it's not. Pretending everything is fine when it clearly, deeply, in all the ways that we can mean it, is not fine. It makes that broken something into the saddest kind of object. The kind of object we have to pretend is still like its old self when it no longer is. The super glue, the superficial glue, it cheapens the thing by trying to provoke us into pretending that it isn't broken when it is. Stephen Jenkinson says it like this. He says, "Our job is not to break our heart. That is the job of the world, which knows very well how to break it. Our job is to be willing to have it broken and to learn to live that way." I had a tagline running through this sermon and I forgot to say it out loud. What kind of people does the future need us to become? What kind of people does the next generation need us to become? What kind of people do the 7 generations need us to become? I want to say 2 things about that here, and I think they're complementary. The 7 generations need, and we talked about this last week, for us to become faithful witnesses. Or if you prefer, hopeful realists. Not falling into the traps of optimism or pessimism, but showing up to see the world as it is with our love and compassion and willingness to engage intact. That's one thing. And the next 7 generations need for us to become skillful practitioners of both grief and praise. Now, some of you have noticed that I preach about grief more often than I teach about praise. It's not because I want to make you morose. Although the power to make someone morose, I suppose, is a thing. But it's not my goal. I wondered in the years before my sister's death why I had such a hard time accessing my joy. Anybody feel like that some days? Like, you know it's there, you know you should be able to feel it, but it seems to slip away when you reach for it. My mother had died when my son was born, so that's 16 years ago now, 14 years before my sister died. And one of the things I realized was that I had postponed my grief. I thought I had unlearned that habit of stuffing my feelings. But as I like to say to my son, denial is not a river in Egypt. He hates it when I say that. He really do. He's so tired of hearing that expression. I don't use it as much as I used to anymore. So I made a pilgrimage. And I took a long weekend of fasting at the ocean by myself. And I did my grieving rituals. And when I got home, I discovered something quite miraculous. Or at least that's how it felt for me. I could touch my joy again. I could feel it alive in my life and my chest again. I found my lost joy under a rock named grief. Now, I'm not suggesting this is the only way. But I meet a lot of people. And most of them are carrying wounds. And a lot of them have tried the super glue. They will tell you everything's fine when it clearly isn't. And for those folks, I invite you to imagine the possibility that the joy you reach for and that slips from your fingers is hiding under the rock of the grief you haven't learned to practice yet. There may be other paths to wise elderhood. I have not traveled them. But I will tell you faithfully about what I know. And when I find some people who know other ways, I'll try to invite them to come up here and temper what I offer with their wisdom. So I had to get through my grief to reclaim my praise, to learn to become skillfully heartbroken. Now, what do these two things have to do with age? Because age is clearly the first thing we think of when we hear the word elder. One could argue they're synonymous. I am making the case that they could have usefully different definitions from each other. Because two words that mean exactly the same thing are not terribly useful. In my experience, it seems like this. The young can bear faithful witness, and they do. But their faith is untempered. It often shows up as a false certainty, or else it crumbles when challenged. But ripe faith is supple. A ripe faith bends under the weight of what is without crumbling and without forgetting its own shape. And although, as Jenkinson says, the world knows how to break our hearts, most often it takes its time. Not always, but usually. So for most of us, we've got to get some years behind us on the road before we've had enough experience of heartbreak to develop some skill. Usually, we've got to break some old stuff again, spend some time scraping off the superglue residue so we can reclaim and honor some of our earlier heartbreaks. So we can sit down with our gold lacquer and do some spirit work with ourselves. Developing skills takes time. Having your heart broken takes time. Figuring out how to do your own soul kintsugi takes time. Figuring out that the missing pieces you couldn't find are the big cracks that let in and out the most light. Learning what Rumi learned, that takes time. So young elders aren't impossibilities, they're just rare. What the 7 generations need from us is for us to make wise elders among the old much less rare. What the 7 generations need from us is to figure out how to make wise elders among the old much less rare. They need us to build the culture and the rituals and the practices that teach us how to become faithful witnesses, that teach us how to become practitioners of praise and grief, that teach us how to become the skillfully heartbroken. How do we do that? How do we do that? I'll sit up here and I will try and drop seeds into your garden plot. I'll throw some sunshine and some cloudy, dismal rain at your garden plot. And I'll hope some of these seeds will take root in you and that you will attend tenderly to the green saplings that grow up in your plot. We say sometimes that we're not doing this work alone. And that is true. We're not doing this work alone. We do it with each other in community like this. We do a lot of it in our small group work. I've talked to several people this week who let me know that they do most of their spirit work in the small groups that we foster here in this church. When there's only 5 or 6 of you in the room and you get to sit there for 2 hours and really be with each other in praise and grief, in reflection, in earnestness, that holds some space for you to tend that little garden plot. So that's important. But I also want to suggest to you that not only are we not in this alone in the rampant individualism of our culture and in the arms of one another as human beings, but that nature can be your teacher. A walk in the woods, sitting with your back against the trunk of a grandfather tree, asking that grandfather tree as a sibling to be part of your grounding, part of your presence in a moment, can be a deep spiritual practice. It is interesting, of all the people I've met, there have been almost none who haven't found some peace in nature. You see, despite what the Roman philosophers might have us believe, we are natural things. We are products of this nature. We are embedded in its web. We are not the solo adventurer, Viking hero, separate from the web of all else that is in our magnificent independence. Although your ego would like you to think that. Your ego would like for you to be addicted to your own competence and self-sufficiency. If you want to know what addiction to competence and self-sufficiency and independence and individualism looks like, just watch the next cabinet meeting. They stream it on C-SPAN several times a week. You can witness firsthand where that road leads. And if that's not cause for grief, friends, I don't know what is. So don't skip the grief part. Don't skip the grief part and go right to being self-righteously pissed off about it. Let yourself be sad that some of your fellow human beings are so lost that they can't connect to anyone any way other than superficially. Because that's the disease we're fighting. That is the disease that we seek to cure with our compassion and our love and our showing up for and with one another. Showing up to the world as it is. Because it is still, all that said, wars in Ukraine and Gaza, starting a new one in South America. It is still a beautiful, miraculous place. And if you don't know that, stroll through the garden on your way out of here. Get out of your head and look with your eyes. And listen with your ears. And feel with your feet. Breathe in the crisp winter air. And remember that today is a gift. And all of this is a gift. And our job is not to squander it. Our job, our duty, our moral obligation is not to squander it. Don't be so wrapped up in your own speech that you can't see the beauty right in front of you. It's a terrible poverty. Yeah, terrible poverty. It's like, I wish you wouldn't use those big words. Why? We all have our own challenges, I suppose. I think our grief literacy as a culture is part of why we aren't producing enough elders. I think, as Jonathan Haidt writes in his books, that self-righteousness is an attractive trap. We are, after all, up here, if not here, pattern recognition machines. That's what we do. And when we recognize a pattern, we develop habits up here about how to engage that. And as many of you know, sometimes those patterns are wrong. And then you got to unlearn them. And that was way harder than the learning, right? Unlearning old habits is way harder than picking up new ones. I promised you something about the path to wise elderhood. Let me try this on for size. You come up against, I've spoken many times, you come up against a moment in your life where you get triggered. This is life inviting you to ask if your habits are aligned with what is. Give it some love, give it some compassion, give it some attention. When you identify the thing that you need to unlearn, here's the question I want to invite you to hold in your heart and in your mind and in your whole being. The thing I want you to meditate on when you're sitting next to the grandfather tree in the woods. What if the space left by that unlearning doesn't have to be filled with a new thought from your own head? What if you don't need to replace that old thought habit with a new thought habit, but you can leave some space to listen to life and love in the world, from the world, in that space you created by unlearning. Elders hold space. That's why it says in here that they don't always have answers, but they see what is faithfully. So what if you don't have to fill in all that space you made with your deconstruction, with new constructions, but it becomes the spaciousness that allows the light to shine through you? I don't have to find that piece of the broken pottery to be whole. I am whole as I is. I am whole as I is. I am whole as I am. And that missing piece is part of my story, part of my reality, part of my history, and it is a gateway to letting the light of love and the divine into me, and to then sharing that with others. Rumi says it, and I'll say it again, the wound is the place where the light enters you. Don't deny your wounds. Let them become your teachers so that you may become the wise elder that the 7 generations need. Amen. Until next time, thank you for joining us on The Pulpiteer. If you enjoyed the podcast, you can help others find it by liking and subscribing. If you'd like to support the podcast directly, you can make a donation at sangabrieluu.org/give. The Pulpiteer podcast is a production of the San Gabriel Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Georgetown, Texas. The podcast is hosted by Spotify, and theme music is by John Faber. Our live recording tech crew this week was Frank Sanders, Rob Berthold, Keith Hutchinson, and Andrea McDaniel. The podcast is produced and performed by Eric Hepburn. See you next time.